Welcome to Veritate with your host, Johnny Mack, a podcast that will dive deep into the pursuit of truth in a world filled with noise, confusion, and fleeting opinions. We will seek to uncover the eternal, unshakable truths that shape our lives and our beliefs, from faith and philosophy to history and culture. We'll explore the questions that matter, challenge the answers we've been given, and seek the wisdom that has stood the test of time. So join Johnny Mack in this journey to discover what's real, what's right, and what's true.
Welcome again to Veritate, and I'm your host, Johnny Mack. We're continuing this season in season 2 of Veritate, of And the Questions, and we're taking a look back at all of the steps I took as far as coming to faith. And today we're going to be looking at Hinduism. Now, I got to remind everyone that I was an atheist at the time as I was looking at all the world's religions, and so I didn't come to Hinduism as a seeker in that romantic sense, but I did come to it in the way that I was trained to approach anything that claims authority. And the first thing you do is you check structure, then consistency, and then whether or not it can hold under pressure. And so that training didn't come from books, it came from uniform. So when you're a Marine and you're a soldier, you learn something very early, and that is that ambiguity gets people killed. And you don't get points for poetry, and you don't get credit for intentions. You need answers that hold when everything else falls apart. And so when I began examining belief systems, I didn't do it emotionally. I did it operationally. So if this is true, can it tell me who's in charge? Can it tell me who I am? Can it tell me what went wrong? And can it tell me how it gets fixed? And so those are questions. They're not philosophical games. They're battlefield questions. And these are questions that you ask when chaos is real, because suffering is not theoretical and consequences are permanent. And so by the time I reached Hinduism, at that time I was still an atheist. And that matters because I wasn't trying to defend Christianity. Remember, I said I held Christianity to the very end. And in many sense, I'd already dismissed it. But I did save it for last because I wanted to go through all of the others before I ever got to Christianity. Because if I'm going to claim to be atheist, I need to be able to defend my position against all faith. It seemed to me at the time Christianity was just too fractured. There was too many voices. There was too many competing claims of authority. And so from that perspective, truth shouldn't splinter like that. And so that's the reason I went backwards. Because in the military, at least when a system fails, you don't just patch the symptom. You trace the failure back to its origin. Hinduism claimed origin, and not just age, but even permanence. Because it didn't claim to begin at the moment in history. It claimed to always exist. Hinduism has no founder. There's no single revelations. There's no decisive event. And so that immediately caught my attention. Because if truth exists, I believed it should survive time. And so Hinduism claimed that it had done that. So I treated that seriously. And like most Westerners, I didn't start with the oldest material that they had. I didn't even know what that was at the time. So I started with what's called the Bhagavad Gita. And it was recommended constantly when I would talk to people about Hinduism. It was touted by most people that I talked to that were Hindus. And it's quoted by philosophers the most. It's praised by soldiers, politicians, and even academics. So it's presented as though it's profound and disciplined and realistic about the human struggle. So it gets presented as it's profound, disciplined, and realistic about the human struggle. And so that appealed to me. You know, it's a man on a battlefield that's paralyzed by doubt. He's questioning duty and moral responsibility. And so that's familiar territory for me. And Krishna speaks to Arjuna about action and detachment and obedience to one's role and order in chaos. And so at first glance, it sounded like something that understood the world as it actually is. And I respected that. But respect doesn't end inquiry. And as I read more closely, I realized that there was something important. And that was that the Gita never stands alone. Because it assumes ideas, it doesn't explain. Gods, it doesn't introduce. A metaphysical framework is already in place, and it speaks with confidence, but it doesn't tell you where that confidence comes from. And so that's a red flag when you're trained to look for authority. And so I did what I always do when something claims legitimacy. I traced it backwards. And that took me to the Upanishads. Now here the tone changed completely because there's no battlefield, there's no dialogue about duty, there's just abstraction and ultimate reality, the nature of the self. the claim that the deepest truth is not relationship, but identity, and that the self is not created. The self is eternal. The self is identical with ultimate reality itself. That was a massive claim, but it raised immediate questions, because if the self is divine, then why does it struggle? And if the self is eternal, then why does it forget? And if ignorance is the problem, where did ignorance come from? And those questions were not answered in the Upanishads. They were bypassed. So then I found you have to go further back. And then you have to go to the Vedas. Now, in the Vedas, philosophy gave way to ritual. Unity gave way to multiplicity. And the divine gets fractured into many gods, each one governing aspects of nature and sacrifice. There's no final authority. There's no corrective mechanism. There's no decisive voice. And so at that point, the pattern became undeniable. This was not one system that was unfolding coherently. It was layers accumulating without correction. Now, as a Marine and a soldier, I've seen this before, because when no one has final authority, problems do not get solved. They get absorbed. They get reinterpreted. They get worked around. But that doesn't mean the system explodes. It just means it drifts. And Hinduism didn't collapse under contradiction. It accommodated it. Because at one point, I actually thought that was a strength. I actually believed at one point that you could possibly be Hindu and Christian at the same time, because Christianity could just be another path, just another expression, another cultural lens aimed at the same truth. And so that idea felt generous, but generosity is not the same thing as truth. Because in the real world, contradictory orders don't coexist peacefully. Someone will eventually always pay the price for that. And that realization is what forced me to stop comparing text. Because Hinduism doesn't ask you to resolve contradictions, it just asks you to include them. And so once contradiction is no longer a problem, then comparison even loses its meaning. So I had to change the approach. I stopped weighing passages and I started to weigh answers. And I asked the same 4 questions that I've asked of every system. I didn't ask as a theologian. I'm not asking as a philosopher. I'm just as someone who's been trained to recognize when a structure cannot hold under pressure. And those questions are simple. Who is God? Who is man? What went wrong? And how is it fixed? Because in my mind, that's where real examination begins. And so who is God is always the first question. And it's not because it's theological, it's structural. Because every system, religious or otherwise, lives or dies on its authority. Someone or something sits at the top of it. Someone or something defines the reality. Someone or something has the right to command, to judge, and to correct. In the military, that's not optional, because if authority is unclear, then orders conflict. And if orders conflict, then discipline breaks. And if discipline breaks, people die. So when I approached Hinduism, I asked the same questions I would ask of any command structure: who is in charge? And so at first, in the Bhagavad Gita, that answer seemed like it was straightforward, because God appeared personal. Krishna speaks, Krishna instructs, Krishna corrects, Krishna claims authority over action, over duty, and order. And so that mattered to me, because a God who speaks can command, and a God who commands can judge, and a God who judges can hold people accountable. And on the surface, Krishna looked like someone at the top of the chain. But even here, something felt off, because Krishna gives orders, but he doesn't ground them in himself in a final way. He speaks as one manifestation among others. He does not claim exclusive authority. He does not say this is the truth and all others are false. That's unusual, because in any serious command structure, authority is not shared indefinitely. At some point, someone has to give the final word. So I had to keep reading. And so that's when I encountered the Upanishads. And then all of a sudden, everything shifted, because God was no longer personal. God all of a sudden became Brahman. He was not a being, not a will, not a commander, just an impersonal absolute, ultimate reality itself. Because Brahman does not speak, Brahman does not issue orders. Brahman does not judge. Brahman simply is. And then suddenly, Krishna looked different. Because if ultimate reality is impersonal, then a speaking God is either symbolic or provisional or secondary. And so that raised a serious problem. You cannot have a final commander who never speaks. And you cannot have binding orders issued by someone who is not ultimately in charge. So at this point, I did what training teaches you to do. I traced that authority upward. So if Krishna answers to Brahman, then Brahman is the highest authority. But Brahman doesn't command. So then who actually holds the authority? And that answer was never clear. So then I found you have to go further back. Then I went to the Vedas. And then here the idea of God fractures completely because there are many gods. They all have different functions, different powers, different rituals. There was fire, storm, order, dawn, sacrifice, and no single god claimed final authority. And none of them correct the others. And none of them issue universal commands. That's not hierarchy, that's plurality. So now the picture looked like this. A personal God who speaks in one text, then an impersonal absolute in another, then many gods with limited domains in the earliest layer. And all of it is called Hinduism. All of it is valid. That's not clarity. That is diffusion. So I had to keep asking the same question. Who is God? And the answer always shifted. God is personal, if that helps you. But God is impersonal, if that helps you. God is many, if that helps you. God is beyond all of that, if you want to avoid the question entirely. And at first, that flexibility did seem peaceful. But again, peace without structure is fragile. Now, here's where my background mattered. In the real world, ambiguity at the top does not produce freedom. It produces drift. Because if authority is unclear, responsibility dissolves. And if responsibility dissolves, then accountability disappears. And without any accountability, evil has no weight. So then I began to realize something very uncomfortable. Hinduism does not answer the question of God at all. It dissolves it. God becomes whatever the seeker needs. He becomes a force, a person, a symbol, a realization. But a God who can be anything cannot say no. And a God who cannot say no cannot judge evil. Now, the reason this mattered deeply to me is because I had seen evil. I have seen chosen evil in the world. And chosen evil demands judgment, not reinterpretation. And at that point, that's where the first crack formed. It wasn't emotional, it wasn't reactionary, it was just structural. Because if I cannot identify who God is, then I cannot know who answers to him. And if no one answers to him, then the moral order is an illusion. And so that realization then forces the next question, because if God is unclear, then man has to be examined next. So who is man according to Hinduism? And again, as I said, once authority becomes unclear, the next question always follows: who answers to that authority? So basically, who is man? And again, in the military, this matters immediately, because you cannot issue orders unless you understand who's receiving them. And you can't hold someone accountable unless you know what they are. What are they capable of? What are they responsible for? So I had to ask Hinduism the same question. Then what am I? Now, here Hinduism can answer with confidence. Man is not a creature. Man is not fundamentally different from God. Man is what's called Atman. He is eternal. He's uncreated. He's indestructible. Because the true self is not the body. It's not the personality. It's not the mind. These are all just temporary, and those things pass away. The real self is identical with the ultimate reality itself. So in simple terms, man is divine. He just don't know that. And so when I encountered that idea, I understood why it appealed to so many people. Because it removes shame. It removes judgment. It removes hierarchy. Because if the deepest part of me is divine, then I'm not broken. I'm just merely unaware. And the problem is not a moral failure then. The problem is just ignorance. You don't need forgiveness. So you need awakening. And at first glance, that sounds humane. But training teaches you to ask the next question immediately. If that is true, then what follows? Because if man is divine, then the man is not accountable in the way we normally understand accountability. That mistakes are not rebellion, that wrongdoing is not betrayal, and that evil is not chosen. It's just a misunderstanding. And so that reframes responsibility, but it also softens guilt. And at first, that did feel relieving. But once again, relief is not the same thing as truth. Something in me resisted that explanation. And it's almost instinctive, because I have seen people and men do things that they knew were wrong. They weren't confused about it. They weren't unaware of it. They weren't even misinformed. They were deliberate. They hid it. They've justified it. They repeated it. And ignorance cannot explain that. And Hinduism anticipates this objection, and then it introduces what's known as karma, that your current life is not the beginning of the story. Your circumstances and your abilities and your limitations and sufferings are the result of actions in a previous life. So you're not suffering unjustly. You're just paying off a balance. Now, that explanation did sound orderly, but again, order without mercy is not justice. And again, here's where my background became impossible to ignore. Because in Iraq, I had seen suffering that could not be explained as deserved. Children, civilians, collateral damage. You can call that a consequence if you want to, but conscience cannot accept that answer. Something in us knows that suffering is not always earned. And Hinduism cannot explain that without stripping compassion of its urgency. Because if suffering is deserved, mercy interferes. And if circumstances are earned, then injustice is an illusion. Now, that may preserve cosmic order, but it doesn't preserve moral order. Hinduism also teaches that the material world itself is not ultimate. It is just Maya. Not non-existent, but not finally real. Attachment to it binds you, and detachment frees you. And again, that sounds disciplined. But it also reframes love, because to love deeply is to bind yourself to illusion. And to detach is to advance. That troubled me. Because love does not feel like an error. It feels like the most serious thing that we do. And so at this point, I started to see the pattern. Hinduism elevates man metaphysically, because man is eternal, man is divine, man is uncreated. But it diminishes man morally, because man is not guilty, man is not fallen, man is not in rebellion, man is just merely confused. And so that explanation couldn't carry the weight of experience, because guilt is not confusion, and conscience is not ignorance, and repentance is not awakening. So it begs a very simple question. If man is divine, then why does he need liberation? If man is eternal, then why does he fear death? If man is ignorance alone, then why does he choose evil even when he knows better? And again, Hinduism does not answer those questions. It just redirects them. And so eventually it collapsed for me, because the system that explains away guilt does not explain human behavior. They just explain it out of existence. And so by this point, I was no longer comfortable. I wasn't angry with it. I was just unconvinced. Because if man is not fallen, then nothing has truly gone wrong. And if nothing has truly gone wrong, then the world makes no sense. And that realization then forces the next question. If this is who man is, then what went wrong? And I'm not asking out of curiosity anymore. I'm asking because reality demands an answer. Something is wrong with the world. Not symbolically, there is something actually wrong with the world. You don't even need theology to see that. You just need honesty. Every culture knows this. Every civilization builds laws around it. Every military trains for it, and we plan for disorder because disorder is real. And so when I asked Hinduism what went wrong, I expected something that's proportionate to the problem. But what I got was something very different. Hinduism's answer is very simple. Nothing went wrong. There was no break, there was no rupture, there was no fall, there was ignorance, avidya. Man just forgot who he is. That's the explanation. And again, that at the time as an atheist, that sounded reasonable. Because if the self is divine and eternal, then suffering must come from misidentification. You think you are the body. You think you are your desires. You think you are separate. And so that false identification binds you to the cycle of rebirth. Pain is not a punishment, it's a consequence. And the universe itself is not broken, just your perception is. But once again, this explanation collapsed under pressure. Because ignorance does not explain intent. Ignorance does not explain concealment. Ignorance does not explain cruelty chosen in full awareness. And I've seen too much to accept that. There's a difference between making a mistake and then knowingly committing and doing the wrong thing. There is a difference between ignorance and betrayal. Every human being knows the difference instinctively because we treat accidents one way and we treat crimes another way. Hinduism erases that distinction. And when you push deeper, Hinduism leans harder on karma. So what looks like injustice in this life is just the result of actions from a previous life. The universe is balanced and justice is preserved. But justice that cannot be witnessed, cannot be appealed, and cannot be interrupted by mercy is not justice as we understand it. It's accounting. And here's where my background makes that impossible to accept. I have seen suffering that wasn't deserved. And not because it happened to someone I cared about, but because it violated every instinct of moral order. I saw children in Iraq. I saw non-combatants. I saw innocent people caught in somebody else's decision. And calling that a consequence does not explain it. It just sanitizes it. And there's also another problem, because if ignorance is eternal, then the problem has no origin. If the self has always been divine and eternal, then ignorance has always existed right along beside it. Which means that the problem is built into reality itself. That is not an explanation. That is resignation. So I ask a question that Hinduism could never answer. If ignorance is the problem, where did it come from? If the self is pure, how did it become confused? If reality is ultimate, how did that illusion arise at all? And the answer that always comes back is either some version of silence or mystery or paradox. But mystery only works when it preserves meaning. But here it erased it. Because if ignorance has no cause, then it cannot be addressed at its root. And if it cannot be addressed at its root, then the solution will never be more than management. And that's where the difference between systems became clear. Hinduism does not see the world as broken. It sees it as misperceived. But again, that misperception does not explain evil. It just explains error. And error does not account for the weight of human history. Wars are not misunderstandings. Genocide is not an illusion. Betrayal is not a misidentification. These things are chosen. And any system that cannot say that plainly cannot carry the burden of reality. And so by this point, I knew that something was wrong with the explanation. Because if nothing went wrong, then nothing needs to be repaired. Only escaped. And escape is not the same as resolution. That realization forced the final question. If this is the problem, then what exactly is the solution? How is it fixed? So when Hinduism explains the problem as ignorance rather than rupture, the solution that follows logically is that nothing is repaired, nothing is reconciled, nothing is restored, man leaves. And Hinduism calls that solution moksha, liberation. Not rescue, not forgiveness, not the healing of a broken relationship, release. You get released from the cycle of birth and rebirth, released from attachment to the world, released from individuality itself. The goal is not to remain human forever. The goal is to stop being bound to being human at all. And that's where that system becomes unmistakably clear. Hinduism does not aim to fix the world, it aims to transcend it. The world is not redeemed, it is just outgrown. And so there are many paths to that liberation. That's presented as a strength, that the path of knowledge, the path of action, the path of devotion, the path of meditation, each is valid and each suits different people. None correct the others. Again, flexibility replaces definition. The path of knowledge teaches realization. You awaken to the truth that you were never bound. The self realizes its identity with ultimate reality. The suffering ends not because it's healed, but because it's no longer taken seriously. Pain loses its grip because the self is no longer identified with it. That is not resolution. That is disengagement. The path of action teaches detachment. You perform your duty. You accept your role. You release attachment to the outcomes. You do not seek justice. You do not resist injustice. You act with the order as it exists. This does not fix suffering. It just teaches endurance of it. Then the path of devotion appears. At first, it seems to contradict the others because devotion implies relationship, love, worship, and personal encounter. But even here, devotion is temporary because the devotee does not remain distinct. The relationship dissolves, the self merges. In the end, devotion leads to absorption, not communion. Now that distinction matters because relationship presumes two, and liberation eliminates one. So at that point, I had to stop and be honest. This solution doesn't match the problem. Because if the world is broken, escape abandons it. If evil is real, detachment ignores it. If love matters, dissolution denies it. And again, here's where my own experience makes this impossible to accept. I have seen men sacrifice themselves for other people. And not because it liberated them, but because it bound them. Love does not detach. Love commits. Hinduism treats attachment as the problem, but attachment is what makes justice urgent. Attachment is what makes betrayal painful. Attachment is what makes sacrifice meaningful. You cannot explain away attachment without explaining away meaning itself. That is why today's definition of love is not true. Love is not love. Love is sacrifice. And that's the final issue. If liberation ends individuality, then identity is a mistake. And if identity is a mistake, then relationship is an illusion. And if relationship is an illusion, then love is a trap. That is not a small conclusion. That is the end of moral seriousness. Because at this point, the entire framework stood exposed. Hinduism does not deny suffering. It denies its ultimate importance. It does not deny evil. It reframes it until it loses weight. It doesn't deny the self. It dissolves it. And here, Hinduism is actually honest. Nothing is repaired. The solution is escape. Escape from the world, escape from attachment, escape from individuality itself. And suffering ends because the sufferer ends. That may quiet pain, but that does not answer justice. And so at that point, the realization is unavoidable. Hinduism does not answer the questions. It rearranges them so that the answers are no longer required. It absorbs contradiction rather than resolve it. It dissolves guilt rather than confront it. It escapes the world rather than redeem it. And again, as a Marine and a soldier, I've learned something early. If a structure can't tell you who's in charge, who answers to that authority, and what failure looks like and how does it get corrected, that structure cannot survive contact with reality. Hinduism survived time, but it does not survive pressure. And that's why I couldn't remain there. And not because Hinduism lacks beauty, but because it lacked insight. It could not say no. And truth must be able to say no. It must be able to say no to error, no to evil, no to illusion disguised as peace. By the end, Hinduism has answered the questions like this. Who is God? Undefined. Who is man? Divine yet forgetful. What went wrong? Nothing. Only ignorance. How's it fixed? Escape. And that framework could not carry the weight of the world I knew. And so I left it. And so then the search narrowed again. Next week, we're going to look at the only other place to go after Hinduism, which is Buddhism. Now, not because it's older and not because it's more popular, but because Buddhism does something very radical. It removes God entirely. So where Hinduism dissolved God into abstraction, Buddhism asks whether God is even necessary to explain suffering at all. So in Hinduism, if Hinduism says the problem is ignorance, Buddhism sharpens this claim. If Hinduism offers escape through liberation, Buddhism systematizes that escape. And in many ways, Buddhism is Hinduism just stripped of gods and metaphysics, reduced to suffering and technique, which makes it the unavoidable next step. So next week, we will ask the same 4 questions again. Who is God? Who is man? What went wrong? And how is it fixed? And this time the answers will be even more unsettling, because if Buddhism is right, then meaning itself is optional. And so that question will be next. And so the questions continue. May God continue to bless you all. In nomine Patri et Filii et Spiritui Sancti.
Thank you for listening to Veritate. If you would like to contact the show, please email us at veritate@yahoo.com. That's veritate@yahoo.com. Thanks again, and we look forward to hearing from you. May God bless you all.